Welcome to Driving a Growth Agenda, a special Art of Procurement series in partnership with iValuer, where we explore how procurement leaders can help their organizations focus on the top line as well as the bottom line. My name is Philip Ideson. I'm the host of Art of Procurement, and in today's fourth and final episode in the series, I want to share why, based on the conversations I have with procurement and non-procurement leaders every day, a focus on growth is so important to the future of our profession. I'll also share some of the ways that we can enable growth and wrap up with some of my key takeaways from the series. Now, before we start, I want to let you know that we also created a printable one-page cheat sheet to accompany this series, which includes the 5 questions to ask yourself as you consider how you can help drive a growth agenda. We included 4 growth levers that procurement can pull and a summary of the procurement foundations you must build to deliver growth. It's everything that we featured and discussed in this series, all in one page, and you can download it today at artofprocurement.com/growth cheat sheet. That's all one word, artofprocurement.com/growth cheat sheet. So the traditional procurement approach has really been to focus on increasing profitability. And within the confines of profitability, you're looking at increasing margins, ultimately by decreasing supplier costs. And that's a really important mandate, of course. And it's one that can provide a very attractive ROI, certainly on an initial investment. But as we all know, if we've been in procurement for a long time, it also very quickly has diminishing returns after, and I kind of hesitate to use the phrase low-hanging fruit, but after that low-hanging fruit of savings has been picked by really running sourcing processes for the first time. After all, we can't reduce supplier costs to zero. And the more successful procurement teams look at a mandate to increase profitability through that total cost lens. So taking into account the knock-on impact of quality, of the cost to serve, of end-to-end supply chain costs, really ensuring that decisions when you're making a purchase are not made in the bubble of a single transaction, a single purchase price, but looking a little bit bigger picture as to where that thing that you're buying, whether it's a product or service, where it fits into kind of a bigger ecosystem, and looking at the costs of making that decision and the knock-on costs of making that decision. Now, I'm not here today to argue that that's not important. In fact, I think it's absolutely critical that for a procurement organization, we are effectively managing costs and increasing profitability in that way. For me, that's really table stakes for procurement. But we've tended, in my experience, to do that instead of enabling growth. Rather than as well as enabling growth. It's kind of been one or the other. I'll put another way, growth, when you look at how do we enable growth as a procurement group, it's kind of been a byproduct of our work, but not necessarily what we've done is linked back to our performance, in terms of how we've supported the business. They'll still look at what we've done through that cost savings, typically, our cost management lens, as opposed to, well, you were able to save that money. That money was reinvested back in the business, which drove growth. And that connection has kind of been lacking in terms of where we talk about what we do in procurement and where our focus is. And honestly, that's led to a bit of a perception problem that the best procurement teams can reduce wasted spend, but we often take that one-size-fits-all approach. As Sylvie in the first podcast in this series says, the biggest problem she actually faces is convincing business stakeholders to work with procurement. Now, it seems important to point out that procurement doesn't need to fix the perception of us so much as we need to change the attitudes, the styles, and the behaviors that have created that perception. As long as we consider ourselves misunderstood, we'll also continue to have trouble aligning with the business. So it's not necessarily a them problem. I look at this as being an us, a procurement problem. And oftentimes I see folks kind of looking and saying, hey, the business doesn't understand me. That's not my issue. When, of course, it really is. Many companies, functions and industries see procurement as being problematic and annoying. And, oftentimes really, if we look deeply at ourselves, some of the services that we offer, can we really see that they're wrong? Now, just to build on that, we did a survey in October of 2020 for a Mastermind Live Summit, where we asked a lot of CPOs, and we had I think for this question, maybe 350, 400 responses on what's the number one problem that the AOP community actually experiences. What's the biggest problem we have? And that perception came up as number one. When I think about why is that perception problem exists, I think that the vast majority of our organizations are placing a greater importance on growing top line revenue through increased sales rather than eking out margin improvements alone. When you think about where do organizations invest their money, I have a couple of examples. When you think about consulting, it's interesting. We had a session within our mastermind community last year talking about the consulting industry. You look at consulting rates, and the management consultancy firms charge far, far, far higher rates. They're able to get much higher rates when they're focusing on the top line kind of strategy work rather than the bottom line work. And that's because our organizations, the people who make those investment decisions, value that top line more than they value the bottom line. Another one is if you look at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Here in the US, for every procurement professional, there's 5 counterparts in sales. And while job growth in sales is projected to be flat to 2% over the next 10 years, it's forecasted to be more than 7% down for procurement jobs. And then if you consider your individual company as it rebounds from the pandemic, according to the IMF, the world economy is going to grow by almost 10% by the end of 2022 in response to the lows of the pandemic. So that means a lot of companies are going to be growing through their market position. They were fortunately in a position where they could, they had the benefit of the change in trends due to the pandemic, but most of the rest are going to be growing to claw back all that was lost during the pandemic. And for all those reasons, I really strongly believe that at best, pivoting the procurement value proposition to include growth enablement can transform our strategic impact. And honestly, at worst, it allows us to continue to maintain relevance. There is no downside as far as I'm concerned from a procurement perspective. So what are some of the ways that procurement can enable growth? Frankly, the best way is to look inside your business. What's the growth strategy of your business? Is it bringing new products to market? Is it expanding into new geographies? Are you looking at improving the level of customer service to existing customers? Are you looking to increase your sales conversion rates or offer a similar level of product or service at a lower price point? You can look at company presentations, read investor call transcripts, ask your key stakeholders, and then go a level deeper. Question your day-to-day stakeholders on how the work that they do actually contributes to the growth of the business. Now, traditionally, we think of enabling company growth from a cost savings lens. I mentioned that before. That savings can be reinvested back into the business, whether that's in increasing their marketing budget or a greater investment in R&D or in increasing profitability margins that make the business more attractive from an investment perspective. And again, I'm not here to say that's not important. That's very important. If you're not articulating or tracking your impact that you have in these areas, then you should definitely start. But again, I would say that that's table stakes. So I thought of some just examples to share of organizations that are contributing to growth, procurement groups that are contributing to growth in different ways. One example is looking at supporting the development of new revenue streams. Sprint here in the US, I interviewed them a couple of years ago live from the iValue Now conference. They leverage their procurement technology platform to actually run forward auctions on used telephone handsets, which has generated them over $1 billion in revenue. The time it was, for every, I think, $2 in savings, there was an additional $1 they were bringing to the table in revenue just through that one initiative. A CPO of a global telecoms firm recently shared an example with me where his procurement team spent time with sales to understand what some of the objections that their sales teams had to overcome during the sales process. They found that field sales teams were often asked about risk management in their supply chain, so procurement built an app that allowed the field sales teams to demonstrate the risk monitoring capabilities in real time. Sales could share that. They could bring up the app whenever they were, with the prospect, and basically answer the question right there and then. And it significantly increased the confidence in the risk management capabilities of that organization and just made that objection kind of go away. And it was just a real benefit for the sales groups as they were obviously trying to sell the products and services of this firm. Speaking of sales, in another organization I know, their sales teams had a challenge in knowing how to navigate, communicate, and negotiate with the procurement teams of their potential and existing customers. So on learning this, the procurement team created a program where procurement professionals would coach their sales teams through the procurement process as issues came up, leading to an increase in their sales conversion rates. Again, my experience is that we often don't speak to the sales folks within our organization. Perhaps we see ourselves as being very different, but really there's so much that we can do in procurement to help sales overcome some of those hurdles that they have as they're going through the procurement process with those prospects. And I know I've shared this personal experience in the past, but in a previous role, one of my then employer's greatest challenges was recruiting high impact employees to a relatively remote geographic location. We worked with HR to find a partner company who would actually build and operate a childcare center at zero operational cost to us, which provided an extra benefit to recruiting those employees who we were really targeting employees in their 30s for who moving to our location would include leaving behind their family support systems for childcare. So it really helped us to continue to recruit the best of the best that we could to bring them to our remote location, which then, contributed to growth because of the employees we were able to recruit. Another role that I had within the automotive business, we built out a regional supply chain to support geographic expansion so that we weren't reliant on, an existing kind of supplier network and supply chain network in a geographic area that was completely the other side of the world from where we wanted to expand, and all the costs, of course, that would have come along with having suppliers located in a very different location than the geographic area that we were looking to build our manufacturing plants from. And of course, think about more generally how you can embrace your suppliers and your supplier ecosystem from an innovation perspective. Because the one thing for sure is it doesn't matter whether you're the biggest company in the world or the smallest company in the world. The R&D capability, the collective R&D capability of your suppliers far outweighs what your own internal R&D capability is. And that's something that, we just don't consistently do a good enough job of tapping into. So to wrap up, I just encourage you to think about your impact in terms of how you can drive organizational growth, whether it's at your organizational level or whether it's at your category level, just depending on your sphere of responsibility. What are the ways that go beyond increasing the profitability and actually start looking at the top line? Now, the final thing that I wanted to just say is how do we then capture that value if we are delivering that value beyond savings that really does contribute to growth? Because in most cases, as a procurement professional, you're likely to have a set of metrics that are very cost savings driven. You must report the impact of non-cost savings initiatives alongside savings, in my experience, even if the non-cost savings value is difficult to quantify. The ways you can do that, you can include some impact statements or some testimonials from your stakeholders and their leadership team. So at least if you can't demonstrate numbers, you can tell a story of your impact, and obviously one that can be reference checked, that can be validated if the people who are looking at your results want to actually go and speak to the individuals involved. And as Sylvie discussed again back in the first podcast in this series, ultimately the best way is to have shared objectives with each business, that are tailored for their needs, and then that rolls up into a balanced scorecard. I think how you do this needs an entirely new podcast, and suffice to say, most of us are not going to get to that stage overnight. It's an iteration because it involves a lot of trust with, changing those metrics if you have cost savings metrics in the first place, so that you're kind of taking the cost savings down and you're increasing the growth related metrics up over time. But as your leadership gets more confidence in your reporting, they're going to begin to trust the value that you're claiming to capture is actually real. And last year on the pod, I actually discussed this with the Simpress CPO, Evan Carson, about how he was able to do this with his CFO. So if I want to just give a few final thoughts on this series about how we as procurement can drive a growth agenda. The first thing that I want to say, and this is something that, again, Sylvie kind of hammered home in that first podcast in the series, think business first. Everything that we're doing is here to serve the business. That doesn't mean that we're here to do everything the business wants. I think that healthy tension is good tension with our business, but you go with that business first mindset. Second is positioning and enabling your suppliers to be your growth engine. I mentioned before, the collective R&D capability of your suppliers is many multiples greater than your own. And third, be curious, think different, and definitely listen. Listen to your stakeholders and what their needs are. Don't be afraid to challenge, but do that with the confidence that you know that you have a program to kind of protect against the risks. We talked about that in the podcast with Alex about risk management, having that to protect the downside in a way that helps rather than hinders your growth. So that wraps up this podcast and this series. I do want to thank you so much for listening in. If you have missed any of the 4 podcasts in this series, or if you want to go and download the printable one-page cheat sheet, which summarizes all the learnings that we shared during these 4 podcasts, I'd encourage you to go to artofprocurement.com/growth series. That's artofprocurement.com/growth series. You'll find on there all the podcasts in the series, plus a link to go and download the printable one-page cheat sheet. Thank you very much, and we will be back.